December 26, 1991. The Kremlin. For 70 years, the red flag of the Soviet Union had flown above this fortress, a symbol of communist power that had reshaped the world. But on this cold winter evening, that flag was lowered for the final time. The Soviet Union, one of history's greatest superpowers, had ceased to exist. How did it happen? How did a state that controlled 15 republics, commanded millions of soldiers, and possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world several times over simply vanish? This is the story of the collapse of the Soviet Union. To understand the collapse, we must first understand what the Soviet Union was. Founded in 1922 after the brutal Russian Civil War, the USSR was a one-party socialist state governed by the Communist Party. It was built on a promise that central planning could create a workers' paradise free from the exploitation of capitalism. For decades, this system appeared to work. The Soviet economy was centrally planned. The state controlled production, prices, and distribution of virtually everything. After World War II, the USSR emerged as a global superpower, rivaling the United States throughout the Cold War. The Union consisted of 15 republics: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and the Central Asian republics, among others. Stability was maintained through state control, political repression, military power, and ideological unity. But beneath the surface, the system was rotting from within. The Soviet economy suffered from chronic, devastating inefficiency. Central planning, the very heart of the communist system, was failing. In theory, central planning would rationally distribute resources. In practice, it was a nightmare. Bureaucrats in Moscow tried to set prices and production quotas for millions of products across 11 time zones. The system couldn't respond to consumer demand. It couldn't adapt. It couldn't innovate. The results were catastrophic. Chronic shortages became a way of life. Food, housing, clothing, basic consumer goods. People would stand in line for hours just to buy bread or toilet paper. In a country with vast agricultural land, stores had empty shelves. Innovation lagged far behind the West, especially in electronics, computing, and manufacturing. While Silicon Valley was revolutionizing technology, Soviet factories were still using equipment from the 1950s. Productivity stagnated from the 1970s onward. The state prioritized heavy industry and military production over civilian needs. You could build a tank, but you couldn't buy a decent pair of shoes. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy wasn't just struggling, it was dying. The Soviet Union devoted between 15 and 25% of its entire GDP to defense, far higher than Western nations. The nuclear arms race with the United States drained enormous resources. Every new American missile system required a Soviet response. Every submarine, every satellite, every weapon had to be matched. Maintaining control over Eastern Europe required a constant military presence and economic subsidies. The Soviet Union was essentially paying to keep its empire intact. Then came Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. What was supposed to be a quick intervention turned into a nightmare. The Soviet-Afghan War became the USSR's Vietnam, costly, unpopular, and unwinnable. Over 15,000 Soviet soldiers were killed. Hundreds of thousands more came home wounded or traumatized. The war damaged public morale and shattered faith in the government. Parents watched their sons come home in coffins, and they asked why. The government had no good answer. As the economy crumbled and the war dragged on, the Soviet leadership was frozen in place. From the late 1960s to the early 1980s, the USSR was ruled by a gerontocracy, government by very old men. Leaders like Leonid Brezhnev maintained stability but avoided any meaningful reform. Brezhnev ruled for 18 years, dying in office in 1982 at age 75. His successors were even older and more frail. Decision-making slowed to a crawl. Corruption became widespread within the Communist Party. Officials used their positions to enrich themselves and their families. Everyone knew it, no one could stop it. Meanwhile, younger generations became increasingly disillusioned with communist ideology. They saw through the propaganda. They knew the West had higher living standards, more freedom, and more opportunity. The gap between official ideology and reality became impossible to ignore. The Soviet Union needed change. Instead, it got paralysis. In 1985, everything changed. Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party. At 54, he was young by Soviet standards, energetic, intelligent, and reform-minded. Gorbachev recognized that the system was unsustainable. Unlike his predecessors, he was willing to act. He introduced two major reforms that would inadvertently destroy the very system he was trying to save. The first was perestroika, restructuring. Gorbachev introduced limited market reforms, reduced state control over enterprises, and allowed some private business activity. The goal was to make the economy more efficient while keeping the Communist Party in power. Instead, perestroika created chaos. The economy didn't know whether it was capitalist or communist. The result was economic confusion, inflation, and worse shortages in the short term. People who had little now had even less. The second reform was glasnost, openness. Gorbachev reduced censorship and allowed criticism of the government. He believed that openness would help identify problems and build support for reform. Instead, glasnost exposed everything. Past crimes like the Stalinist purges, corruption at every level, economic failures the government had hidden for decades. Rather than strengthening the system, transparency destroyed whatever legitimacy the Communist Party had left. Gorbachev had opened Pandora's box and he couldn't close it. 1989 was the year the empire crumbled. Gorbachev abandoned the Brezhnev Doctrine, which had justified Soviet military intervention to preserve communist governments. He signaled that the USSR would no longer send tanks to keep its satellites in line. The people of Eastern Europe heard him loud and clear. Communist regimes collapsed like dominoes. Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. Decades of Soviet control vanished in months, sometimes in days. The most powerful symbol came on November 9, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. East Germans poured through the barrier that had divided their city for 28 years. People danced on top of the wall. They took sledgehammers to it. The world watched in astonishment. And the Soviet Union did nothing. No tanks rolled, no soldiers mobilized. The lack of intervention signaled weakness, not just to the world, but to the USSR's own republics. If Eastern Europe could break free, why couldn't they? Glasnost didn't just expose corruption, it allowed suppressed ethnic and national identities to resurface. The Soviet Union was a multinational empire. Russians made up only about half the population. The other republics had their own languages, cultures, and histories that often included being conquered and oppressed by Russia. For decades, these identities had been suppressed. Now, under glasnost, they exploded into the open. Republics began demanding autonomy. Then they began demanding independence. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania led the movement. They formed human chains hundreds of miles long to demand freedom. They declared their independence and dared Moscow to stop them. Even Russia itself, under Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, positioned himself as a rival to Gorbachev. He spoke of Russian sovereignty, Russian democracy, Russian freedom from the Central Soviet center. Power was shifting away from the central government, and there was nothing Gorbachev could do to stop it. By 1990 and 1991, the Soviet Union was in free fall. GDP contracted sharply. Inflation rose as price controls weakened. The ruble became worthless. Living standards declined dramatically. Crime surged. Black market activity became the only way many people could survive. Trust in state institutions collapsed completely. People stopped believing in anything the government said. The Communist Party rapidly lost members and authority. Officials resigned or simply stopped showing up to work. The state was disintegrating before everyone's eyes. The question was no longer whether the Soviet Union would survive, but how it would end. August 1991, hardline communists had seen enough. While Gorbachev was on vacation in Crimea, a group of Communist Party officials, military leaders, and KGB agents launched a coup. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest and declared a state of emergency. Their goal? Reverse the reforms and preserve the Soviet Union. Tanks rolled into Moscow. It looked like the old Soviet Union was reasserting control. But something unexpected happened. The coup failed. Public resistance was strong. Ordinary citizens confronted the tanks. Soldiers refused orders to fire on civilians. And Boris Yeltsin emerged as a hero, standing on top of a tank and rallying opposition to the coup. Within 3 days, the coup collapsed. The plotters were arrested. Gorbachev returned to Moscow. But he returned to a different country. The failure of the coup had destroyed the last remaining confidence in the Soviet state. If the hardliners couldn't save the Union, then the Union couldn't be saved. After the coup, events moved quickly. One by one, the republics declared independence. Ukraine, Belarus, the Central Asian republics, even Russia itself began acting as an independent nation. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in a forest lodge and signed the Belavezha Accords. With the stroke of a pen, they declared that the Soviet Union no longer existed. They didn't ask Gorbachev's permission, they simply announced it was over. On Christmas Day, Gorbachev went on television and resigned as president of a country that no longer existed. And on December 26, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. In its place rose the white, blue, and red tricolor of Russia. The Soviet Union was dead. So what caused the collapse? There's no single answer. It was a perfect storm of interconnected failures. Economic inefficiency and stagnation, unsustainable military spending, failed central planning, loss of ideological belief, political reforms that weakened control, nationalism within the republics, loss of the Eastern European buffer states, the failed coup attempt, leadership conflicts. Each factor reinforced the others until the entire structure collapsed under its own weight. The consequences were profound. The collapse ended the Cold War, leaving the United States as the sole global superpower. It triggered economic collapse and tremendous hardship in the post-Soviet states. It redrew the political map of Europe and Central Asia, and its effects continue to shape our world today. From the war in Ukraine to tensions between Russia and the West, the ghost of the Soviet Union still haunts international politics. The Soviet Union lasted 70 years. Its collapse took less than 2. In the end, an empire built on ideology, control, and military might was undone by its own contradictions. The red flag came down. The world would never be the same.